Welcome back, everyone. My name's Jeremy, and this is the Towards Data Science podcast. Now, there's no question that AI ethics has received a lot of well-deserved attention lately. But if you ask the average person what AI ethics actually means, you're as likely as not to get a blank stare. Now, I actually think that's largely because every data science or machine learning problem comes with a unique ethical context, so it can be hard to pin down ethics principles that generalize to a wider class of AI problems. Now, fortunately, there are researchers who focus on just this question, and my guest today, Sarah Williams, is one of them. Sarah's an associate professor of urban planning and the director of the Civic Data Design Lab at MIT's School of Architecture and Planning. Her job is to study applications of data science to urban planning and to work with policymakers on applying AI in an ethical way. Now, through that process, she's distilled several generalizable ethics principles that have practical and actionable implications in the context of AI. So we're going to be talking about that this episode. We'll also be having a wide-ranging discussion about everything from the way our ideologies can color our data analysis to the challenges that governments face when they're trying to regulate AI. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you do as well. All right. Well, Sarah, thanks so much for joining me for the podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
You're working in an area that I think is one of these, underserved areas. It's an area that people in data science don't tend to think a lot about, but it's also very fundamental to the way we live. And it's an area where the rubber tends to meet the road for a lot of government policymaking, and it forces us to confront issues in AI ethics maybe more directly than others. And that's this idea of urban planning. So you're at the Civic Data Design Lab at MIT. I'd like to first off get a bit of a sense from you for the kind of work you're doing day to day there and how it ties into data and data science.
The Civic Data Design Lab really, at its essence, is thinking about how we can use data to create policy change. One of the main ways that we do that work is through data visualizations and communicating the insights of data. But in order to do that, obviously, we have to do data analytics. And we also build teams to work with us, working with government, policymakers, stakeholders in the community to really identify the questions that we are seeking to answer, doing the quantitative analysis and then really bringing it to the public. And I think that's one of the things that might be a little bit different from other academics in the data science field is this idea that not all kind of analytics are accessible to everyone. And in order to really act on data, we need to make that more accessible and communicate to broad public, such as the press and the media, but also to community members and diverse groups of policy, people who are making the policy decisions so they can take action.
Yeah, I find that in and of itself a fascinating idea. And it's something that I think gets lost in translation a lot with this focus on machine learning engineering, scaling powerful AI systems, all the kind of technical details. People sometimes forget that data science ultimately has to be applied to be valuable. And that involves a communication piece, which is like, without that, what are you really doing ultimately?
Yeah.
And in some sense, this sort of brings me to one of the themes that you discuss in the book that you wrote.
Yeah.
Which incidentally, if anybody's interested, it's called Data Action, Using Data for Public Good. It's a really interesting piece of work on a whole bunch of topics we'll be diving into today, actually. But one of these themes is the idea that the lens that you use to look at your data, the incentives of the person who's doing the analysis will often affect what comes out and the recommendations that come out of it and the insights that come out of it. Can you speak to that a little bit, and then maybe how that plays into your interactions with policymakers? Like, how do you make sure that you're giving, let's say, a reasonable, balanced perspective to those policymakers?
Super great question. I'm so glad you asked it, right? I mean, we often equate data with truth or knowledge. It's a fact. How could we possibly have any kind of bias in it? But of course, data is a tool, just like a pen is onto paper or paint is on a canvas, and it really represents the objectives of somebody who's using it intentionally or unintentionally. And what I mean by this is it's powerful in persuading us, and people might push a data set to a certain area to kind of get the results that they want. And so one thing I always tell my students when they're looking at data analytics is interrogate who made that data and for what purpose, right? So like, what's their objective of creating this particular analytics, and is there any possibility that they might benefit from it in some way, because data is tricky. We create it with facts, so we believe it almost instantly when we see a chart. So to be like, maybe interrogate it more. And then part of what I tell data scientists is interrogate your own objectives, right? Like, you might not realize like what you're trying to do to persuade people, because you will bring that to bear when you put together your algorithms, or and this is true for many of the AI models. They are full of all of our biases, and so to really interrogate those biases to identify what harm they might be producing.
It's interesting. One of the kind of implicit problems in any kind of high dimensional problem like data science is that overfitting is an issue, and you just have so much data that you can, I don't know if it was Mark Twain who said this, but something like you can prove everything with statistics except the truth, or it was something like that.
I love that it was Mark Twain that said that. That's
yeah, I'm sure I'm butchering that somehow, but just this idea that you have all these spurious correlations, that's one layer of it, is just like the fact that if you look hard enough, you'll find that the price of shoelaces is correlated to the number of clouds in the sky through the last 10 years or something like that. Yeah. But then there's a separate question of if you're intent on making a certain case and you actually effectively p-hack. I mean, is that what you're describing here? Something akin to p-hacking in broader academia?
Yeah, I mean, certainly you could add as many variables as you want and can get, the regression analysis that you want. So really interrogating that. But I also think the way that you ask questions can also unintentionally do harm, or the way that you apply data. And I'm just thinking, about like the same data set can be used in two different ways, even like, so for two different purposes. Like, I'm thinking about a project that we talk about in the book, which is looking at stop and frisk data. And ultimately, the police department in New York City released stop and frisk data, which is a public record. And the ACLU analyzed it and found out that it really, the police overstopped African Americans, overstopped Hispanics. And so we're able to make data visualizations of that to prove that the policy had serious concerns in terms of racial profiling. But that same data set on the other side in the police department was used for racial profiling, right? And so they used that data and the analytics to target areas to go to do more stop and frisks, which are considered illegal search and seizure in the United States now, after the ACLU did these data visualizations. So I think it's also from what perspective are you using a data set or doing the analysis, right? So on the one hand, the police are using it to, kind of think about policing policies that strategically target certain kinds of community. On the other hand, the ACLU flipped it on its head and used it as a way to expose racist practices. So it's just thinking about the objective of the person who's doing that analysis.
And how, in your own mind, do you parse out the correlation causation issue there? So, for example, I imagine, and this is a routine debate in this area, we have people who say, these communities are targeted because of their ethnicities or the color of their skin or their demographic characteristics. We have other people who say, well, crime is higher there. That's why you need more policing. That's why this is happening. And so you have essentially a feedback loop. Not to say the feedback loop is desirable, but that at least is the argument on that side. How do you kind of disentangle these two and look for cause and effect rather than correlation in that context?
Yeah, I mean, I think in that specific policy, it was explicitly targeting minority neighborhoods, and yes, maybe there is more crime in those neighborhoods, but the fact that it had specific target. But maybe I'll step back and say, I think one thing with police data in particular, is they often go to places where there's more crime, but they're not thinking about the systemic issues underlying it, such as maybe lack of job training programs, or better education system, or kind of better social services. So like, I also think like flipping on the head of why these communities might have more crime is also an important thing to look at when we look at these data sets. So, I find like, the use of police data to say, oh, we have a hot spot, now let's go there and put more police, kind of problematic, because it's not actually solving the problem. Rather, the problem is, persistent poverty in many communities that causes some of these heightened crimes.
So it's interesting. It's almost as if there's a separate step then between, okay, we have this visualization. It seems to invite us to jump to a certain conclusion,
Yeah.
but then there's this extra step of almost policy making, saying, okay, the correlation is not necessarily the causation. There might be a more interesting story to be told here. Let's see. Yeah, interesting.
Right. And we don't often go to the causation part, right? Like we were saying high crime, therefore go to that neighborhood. But actually what is causing high crime in those neighborhoods is almost rarely addressed.
And would you see a similar, so I'm interested in the sort of human failure modes that cause us to see our outgroups as kind of thinking in irrational ways. So for example, in this particular case, right, we clearly have there's a group of people who go, oh, I'm just gonna, the crime there is high, I'm gonna go in there and stomp it out. Then there's another group that might look at that and say, oh, okay, that's an indication of ill will on your part. And so it's kind of interesting to parse that out, in that it seems to me that there, as you've described in the book, like the lenses matter so much. Like you can look at the same process, the same data, and say, oh, a completely different story applies here.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, so that's the trickiness of data analytics, and why I think over time it's been used for good and bad purposes, to kind of say it more simply. And so that's one of the things that at the end of the book, I talk about 7 principles of working with data for action. And the number one is to really interrogate your reason for doing the analysis and whether it potentially could do anyone harm. And so, I think in the case of the police departments, I would really hope that they would think about what are some of the unintended consequences of using the data in that way. I think, unfortunately, data-driven policing is so ingrained in our society right now that really changing that idea is difficult. But I think the recent conversations over the summer have really helped to make efforts to help highlighting that. So these conversations about defunding the police are talking about moving police funding into social services, right? Which is the same argument. Like, look at the systemic issues, not and if we can police towards thinking about how to, help bring people out of poverty, we might really be able to do something. So I was really encouraged by something. I mean, I don't think we should necessarily defund the police, but I do think allocation of money towards these systemic reasons, rather than just sending police officers to these same neighborhoods. Why, we keep doing the same thing over and over again, isn't that the definition of crazy? So let's think of a new system. So I like how that, and I like how the data can bring you there too, because it can tell you that those neighborhoods need help in the same way that it tells you that they have high crime.
Yeah, it's fascinating how the moment we see a visualization or a plot, it's almost like part of our responsibility to carry out a further level of analysis gets abstracted away, where we look at it and we're like, oh, to go back to the same example, there's a hotspot, and so let me draw the straightest line I can to the most immediately proximate causal pattern or story. I imagine this is happening all over the place. I mean, I've seen it myself. At my company, right? We'll look at some usage pattern and be like, oh no, people aren't signing up, or something terrible is happening. You jump to a conclusion, and it turns out you're just completely wrong. How do you recommend people start to interrogate that thought process? I mean, are there specific steps people can go through to sort of step back and try to make sure they're doing that?
I was so glad you asked that question. And that's one of the reasons that I also talk about in the book, like bringing teams together to kind of ground truth your results, not kind of ground truth your results, do ground truth your results. And what I mean by that is, actually seeing on the ground if what you say is true, but asking community members or policy experts or people who are stakeholders in the area they're looking at, whether your analytics rings true to them. And I almost always find the first time I do an analysis, when I bring it to groups of people, they're like, no, 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 you're not looking at this aspect of it. This is like that, and I think that kind of editing process is super important, especially in the policy world, because there's always a blind spot that we might be missing and is really helpful. And I think, in the past, in the 50s and 60s, when we used data a lot in city planning, and we did just do that straight line kind of the most efficient way to get through the city is to build this highway through this neighborhood. This is the straight line. This is what the data told us. And we didn't think about all of the other kinds of, let's say, side effects that it would have. And had we brought these analytics to communities to ask them their thoughts of it, I think we might have gotten, let's say, a more nuanced highway system, as it were.
Yeah, no, I'm sure this is true in so many areas, and it's scary how much is being left on the table in terms of optimization when we define the problem. I guess it's about defining the problem narrowly, or at least it's like representing the world with too limited a feature set. We say that this is like what the problem is. These are the features that are important, whatever my model says. It's that ability to kind of tell yourself, okay, I have a loss function or I have an optimization function. As long as that number goes up, I'm happy. And if it doesn't, I'm not. And that's the end of the story. It's sort of a risky business.
Yeah. And I mean, it scares me because, there's so many great people who are interested in urban data analysis or data analysis for policy, but are maybe not versed in, urban issues or other kinds of policy issues. And so they might come up with the answer to this optimization problem, not realizing, somebody's already done that in the past and it went like very awry. And so again, that's why I think it's so important for data scientists to always match themselves up and pair themselves up with the person who's really an expert in that area to help them edit and ground truth their results. But yeah, we don't want history repeating itself at all.
Well, and now on the other side of the ledger too, I think there's like this interesting discussion that I've seen. Actually, I've seen it on Twitter between folks at OpenAI and OpenAI's policy team. I think Amanda Askell recently tweeted about this. I thought it was an interesting point. She was highlighting the fact that there is also a tendency to find sort of one argument against the ethical deployment of a particular system, and using the mere existence of that argument to then implicitly dismiss the deployment completely. So to a priori say, okay, this algorithm has some form of bias, or inevitably all algorithms will have some kind, or some kind of deficiency ethically. Therefore, we shouldn't deploy it. What are some of the ways that you imagine kind of balancing that log? Like, how do you decide, like, do the ethical negatives outweigh the positives? Obviously, this is a complicated question, but how would you start to think about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great question. I've been thinking a lot about it, since the Timothy Gabru, being fired from Google. And, I think what was really cool about Google having an ethics team internally is to really suss out where your biases might lie and fix them, or attempt to fix them or address them, right? Rather than sweep them under the rug, or, and like that kind of having somebody kind of going in and investigating internally the ethics of your work just makes you a better company, because you'll make better algorithms in the future. And so like you'll work towards that goal. And because I think data analysis is an iterative process. We don't get it right the first time ever, right? It's something that we build on. And so we can build on these lessons to create, I believe, more ethical AI. And so I was really surprised, by I mean, obviously, there's lots of politics there, I'm sure, and other things, but I think that Facebook and Google will make better products if they have somebody interrogating their ethics, because then they can go back and make it more ethical. So I guess that's a kind of long-winded way to say, I think we can work towards it, but we should continually be interrogating our work.
And how do you think about the sort of, I think you referred to it in the book. It was interesting. You used the language of ideology. So the ideology that informs our data analysis, which I think is a fascinating and totally correct way of looking at it, because that really is, we're all possessed by our ideology. We all have a version of ourselves that we enter that's mindless, that's not analytical, and that just goes with groupthink and whatnot. Are there consistent issues, do you think, within, take a company like Google? You have a certain collection of people who think about the problem a certain way. I mean, AI ethics in particular, I mean, I think it's fair to say it's a field, for example, that has a disproportionate number of people who would think in a pro-technological sense, like what would you call it, like technologically accelerationist, that might be more, let's say, more socially oriented and things like that. Like, is there an issue at the level of the field itself, do you think, where it needs to kind of think about more ideological diversity in terms of the way it approaches these problems? And if so, I mean, are there active measures being taken to move in that direction as far as you know?
I mean, exactly. You hit it right on the nose, I think, right? Um, it's not just interrogating the ethics of the algorithms, but making sure that there's a diversity of people working in that space. And, particularly making sure that minority groups, BIPOC groups are working in this space to bring, because I do think the technology field has been dominated with one kind of ideological perspective. Um, that's maybe not always so sensitive to all the diverse people that exist in that data, right? Because all data represent people. And when it's, analyzed with one type of group. And so, this is why groups like Data for Black Lives are starting to come up, that are kind of thinking about ways to make sure that we have diversity in the field. Super important. And I think it also help us both interrogate the algorithms, but make and generate new ways of looking at data sets from a much different, maybe from a perspective of those on the margins as well.
And do you think about that as well in like more political ideological terms? I mean, Silicon Valley historically, for example, is actually this is a common complaint that you hear at a lot of these what do you call it, like tech hearings at Congress, right? So you'll have typically Republican senators or congressmen saying, and men and women saying, "Hey, there's this dearth of conservatives working at Facebook. You have overwhelmingly sort of more left-wing people, more liberal-minded people working at Facebook." This is kind of a different axis, right? We have this idea of, yes, like a sort of mono-ethnic or majority, one kind of ethnicity, one kind of physical person working at these companies. Then we have ideological diversity, sort of gap, a big delta. It's in Silicon Valley, sort of overwhelmingly, if you look at polling, excuse me, overwhelmingly going in one direction rather than another. Is that something that you consider to be worth addressing as well? Or do you see that as part of a sort of separate question?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. I think, at least in like the political realm, we have seen data definitely deployed equally by both conservatives and Republicans in the same way in terms of election. I mean, like the Cambridge Analytica scandal is a great case in point, which is like,
Mhm.
conservatives really deploying data. And some might say, Facebook was, I mean, there's so many links in the Cambridge Analytica to Facebook that they were really working towards that operative. Of course, Mark Zuckerberg would say, well, these are people outside of Facebook that were, basically developing conservative advertising, conservative targeting. So I would say that I'm not sure I completely buy the argument that it's a like a totally liberal kind of field. Or maybe a better way to put it is I definitely think that they work for objectives of both sides of our parties. And some might say that they've been worked more towards the conservative side than been deployed on the more liberal side. So
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting and complex area. I guess I'm interested in like the mapping, between those two kind of positions where you have people say, well, it comes down to the people who make up the organization. And if those people have a particular perspective, whether that's because of skin color or gender or political ideology, like I'm fascinated about what it is, what the differences are between those different axes that we should be minding and cautious. Obviously, it's a complicated question.
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated because I think in the end of the day, like Facebook, Google's like their bottom, I say their God is money, right? And
Optimization functions.
Like money, right? So I think they'll, sell themselves to the highest bidder, whether they're like liberal at presence. But I agree, like, there are maybe more liberals in those companies, but again, I think they often work towards that other goal that maybe outside of that. I would say that Republicans have systematically used data, really for a very long time, even I would say since the first census came out in the 70s. They saw this digital census, and there's actually a person named Thomas Hoffletter who basically redistrict most of the US and has been the Republican head of redistricting since those early years, and systematically used data to push around congressional districts towards the Republican majorities. And he's often cited as like the Michelangelo of gerrymandering because he was so good at kind of moving these data sets around. So but then often people talk about Obama election being attributed to his really keen use of data analytics to target new populations that perhaps haven't voted. So, I mean, your question was more, I think, about like thinking about the ideological perspective of the data that we use, though. But
which I think you're making a great point on that too. Is it's like it's this amazing power. And it goes in like we got to be careful how we wield this stuff. Actually, related to that. Now, I did want to ask about your interactions, in fact, with policymakers, because I guess you've spoken to some of them about these problems, concrete problems in ethics. So one question I have: we talk about policy, we talk about government. The word that I don't associate with policy and government is speed. I don't tend to think of like quick, fast responses. And in a world where we're seeing GPT-3 come out, GPT-4 is going to be around the corner. Who knows what else is next in other areas? We're getting more and more of these abilities developing over time, and the pace of change is increasing. What do you think about response times? I guess in the policy world to begin with, has your experience been that the speed is indeed slow, or is it? Am I wrong? I could easily be.
Yeah, no, policy is absolutely slow because it takes this kind of chipping away at different factions, like bringing people onto your team. There's so much work to be done just selling people on your particular perspective of or idea. So I think policy work will always take a long time. I think because of that kind of building of relationships that are needed. I think that people also talk about the speed within government to do some of these data analytics, and I think particularly Bloomberg. I know in New York City really kind of spent a lot of, he was a data company. So when he became mayor, he really wanted to create this data analytics team. And he was, very successful in helping to deploy and use data to help a number of areas of government, but still did very much experience these kind of blockages, like based on policy and politics, which will always exist. And I think that data analytics is just one tool in that wheelhouse, right? That we can use. It's, it helps really convince us of certain strategies and ideas. And it is the policy analyst tool, as it were. What I hope I'm doing, I'm head of the urban science program at MIT, which is a combination of computer science and urban planning, is teach planners and policy experts to do their own data analytics and be able to, if we have more policy people who can do that themselves, maybe we can speed up some processes. But I think no matter what, these kinds of, let's say, relationship building things will exist.
And so that's fascinating, and it speaks to kind of the architecture of the problem, that it makes more sense to get government policymakers to actually start to leverage these tools for themselves rather than have, I guess, an external consultant come in and tell them, hey, I looked at the data, here are the plots. Hopefully that helps them make the case internally. Is that sort of the idea, that they have that flexibility?
Yeah, like that they can do it, or even read what the consultant's doing, right? Because the consultants sometimes aren't as concerned about the constituents, or the consultants are not. So, learn to be able to do the data analysts, and maybe they don't perform it, but they know how to critique that work more quickly and kind of interrogate it for its accuracy. But I have seen just like, even in the last 10 years, like lots of urban planners know how to use mapping software and computer mapping software, something that didn't, used to send to a technician. And now they can do those kinds of, socio-demographic maps really quickly. Even under COVID, we've seen so much work happening, looking at what neighborhoods are marginalized or not. And that's, a lot of that work is happening internally to, public health departments that now have, statistician experts as well.
Well, yeah, and it seems like such an important thing to get government sort of limber and loose with this stuff. I guess I imagine it would have been a challenge too, to just approach them in the first place and convince them, like, hey, there's value to this, because you sort of face a cold start problem, don't you? I mean, you go to a government, you say, hey, you have a bunch of data, it can be leveraged and used for a whole bunch of great things. But then the government, I assume understandably, will say, whoa, like, hands off our data. You need to show me value before, but you can't show them value before because you don't have the data. Is that a cycle that occurs when you start to engage on this stuff?
Yeah. What's interesting about what you're saying is we often assume like this government has this big treasure trove of data, where like actually usually they don't, right? They're trying to get it from private companies such as Google and Facebook and Twitter, or other data sets that need to purchase it, or like real estate investment companies. So I think that the government are excited to do this in data analytics, and then are looking for ways to partner with some of these private organizations to be able to do the analysis that they want. Just like, like think about real estate values. Those data sets are created by private companies, but can be really useful for understanding the dynamics and economic dynamic nature of the city. So I think cities struggle both to pay for data sets like such as that, or and not and why don't I say not all departments are data poor, where like the police department again has tons of money to buy these kind of data, because we allocate a lot of resources to that. But then what's interesting is they don't share it with the planning department. Anyways, we get back to politics again, right? And that, but I would also say, I think another reason that, let's say, cities aren't able to get some of these analytics off the ground is they don't have people internally to drive that. And I do see that we are starting to see cities experiment with it more. Bloomberg was one, Philadelphia, Boston have these small teams that are trying to be really experimental internally and build that kind of process up. But it's something that we need to be building.
And I guess given the kind of potentially privileged access to very private data that cities and governments will have too, privacy becomes a real issue here. How are you thinking about like the evolution of privacy in a world where cities and states and countries are eventually going to be deploying this stuff more and more?
Yeah. Again, with the privacy thing, I think what, you know, governments do have a lot of our private data. And I think that they actually have a lot of, let's say, laws in place to help maintain that privacy. I think where we don't have the laws in place are in the data that these private companies have. We sign all of our privacy away, and then they can do a lot with that data. And I guess like a good maybe like a year ago in the New York Times, they had this article about, all of the cell phone data that you can buy. Like you can even figure out like where people are in the White House or the Pentagon. It was a great story because you can buy that data from a third party reseller. They're not giving us your point per se, or this is, John or Jeremie, but you can very well track people, and that data isn't regulated at all. There are no privacy laws right now for it. And I think this is a huge gap that we're not paying attention to, right? Like, we always talk about like, well, is government, government is, has a lot of laws around it. So they often buy these data sets from the private companies. And it has serious privacy concerns. So I think another kind of way to explain this is like, we ask private companies to self-regulate, but it's not in their best interest to do so, right? Like, why would they do that when their business is built on of all of our data? On the other hand, government should be doing the regulation, but they don't because they have a benefit for it being unregulated because they can purchase the data. They also say that it drives business. So like in that kind of impasse, like we have some serious concerns for our privacy because neither one of those groups are working towards thinking about that. And so that's where I really think the role of data intermediaries comes in place. Like I think we need to have a group, organizations that are helping to help set some more goals, standards for both privacy, to be lobbying for those privacy laws, and also ways of also using that private data for public good. Can they, if the government does want to use that kind of very detailed point data set, can they aggregate it to a point where you can't identify somebody, and then it's used for, it can be more useful. And so I think this is something that we're going to see in the future, this idea of intermediaries between private organizations and government that are helping to maintain privacy of data sets.
That's really fascinating as an idea, especially when, I don't know, one of the privacy issues that I imagine is going to come up more and more is like, back in 2000 and I don't know when I joined Facebook, 2008 or 9, something like that. I gave away a whole bunch of my private information. Of course, 2008, 2009 was about 3 years before AlexNet came out, and all of a sudden we had reliable computer vision that could recognize faces. I gave Facebook my data before I knew that it was machine learningly possible to extract so many of these insights from my data. So it's not even just that I consented to give away my data, it's that I implicitly consented to Facebook or whoever else doing whatever technology and time would allow to that data. That seems like the kind of thing the average consumer just isn't tuned for. Governments, would have to be more forward thinking, and some kind of intermediary starts to make a lot of sense in that context too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, also the problem, right, is like technology often moves way faster than government can catch up to. And definitely the hearings about Facebook were case in point where, congressmen didn't understand kind of basic ways in which it works. And so I think that's also where these intermediaries become important. They're educating our policymakers of kind of the things that they do need to be addressing, and to try to be more forward thinking in the way that you say. But that's also why I think when we're working with data, we have to come up with our own ethical standards of practice, because there is that gap of time where, the government isn't going to protect us and the companies are, trying new things. And so we need to be thinking about like the ethics beyond our own use, because it's something that's so new, it hasn't been thought of before, right?
And for applications like, I alluded to the facial recognition thing. I mean, it feels like our abilities with machine learning just keep growing exponentially, and I feel like we should expect them to do so. That we should get to a point where, or we could get to a point where that time delta between when the technology is developed in-house at the company and when it's finally regulated by governments is a time during which really awful things could be done. Do you think that we're heading towards a world where governments have to, let's say, enact anticipatory regulation, maybe even force things like bottleneck controls on compute infrastructure, like have KYC, know your customer sort of regulations that force, say, AWS to say, okay, you want to use our servers for what? What was that again? What did you want to use them for before they actually allow? Like, is that something that we're headed towards in the long term, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I can't see that because I can see people saying that it would block innovation, right? But I do think that, um, like, I do think that we need to make more, let's say, regulations in the same way that we do with, like, let's say, electricity. So, the ways in which it can be used, how it can be distributed, like, or how data can be distributed. I definitely think there's a certain set of regulations that need to be put in place along those lines. Also because, I think the government absolutely has to do this because now private companies have more data than they do. And, as we know, data is power. So in a way, these institutions are becoming the governing institutions for many areas, right? Because they set the standard of practice. It's not government that's setting the standard of practice. So I do think these kinds of, and this is maybe what you're trying to say, is like setting some standards of practice that governments say to operate in this country, you need to have at least these kinds of ethical standards that you abide by. I think it is essential for making sure that the public is safe, really, because when private companies are really running everything. I don't know if I was online this week when the Google outage happened. I don't know if you were
Oh,
online,
yeah. I
but
was trying to figure out whether it was it's like I use Superhuman for my email, which, sorry to everybody
yeah.
listening, I hate to be another superhuman person, but my Superhuman was down. Yeah, and I was trying to figure out what's going on, and then I went to Gmail, and I was like, oh, Gmail's down. Oh my God. Then it
Yeah.
became serious. So sorry. Yeah.
Right? I mean, they're running our infrastructure, and it's like,
Yeah.
these kind of monopolies are really scary. Well, I do a lot of work in Africa, and what was crazy is we had like a call that morning in Nairobi. We're actually building, community-based wireless infrastructure in Nairobi, but like our whole team was blacked out because Google operates many of the switches in Africa. Like,
Wow.
and right, so like lots of the continent went dark. I mean, we went dark as well, but it makes you realize how much they're part of our, everyday infrastructure, something that the government used to run. I mean, government never used to run internet, but like the same
Yeah.
way that we have other kind of like roads and so forth. But that's why I feel like it's very similar to electricity in that way. We depend on, it's a public good. We depend on electricity every day. We depend on the internet. It is a public good. We need it to sustain our current life. And so, I think it's, absolutely important that like more processes are put in place to help protect us.
Well, hopefully we can figure those out. I'm sure you'll be a big part of that effort too as it comes about.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's why we're seeing these monopoly cases come up right now, right?
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too, because there are so many questions now about what is a monopoly when you look at Amazon and they'll claim, oh, we only have 40% market share tops in all these different areas. And but you look at like, yeah, it's all these different areas. I mean, you own like you can undercut prices in one area for another and so on. So you have to redefine what monopoly means
Yeah.
potentially anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Exactly.
Thanks for a very well-rounded conversation here. I think there isn't really a topic we didn't touch, but if anybody's interested in following you, I do want to flag the book again, by the way, everybody. It's so Data Action, Using Data for Public Good. That is the name of the book. But could you share your Twitter handle as well, or any other website, stuff like that?
Yeah, sure. You can get me at Data So. So Data SEW, my initials, but it's also sewing, I guess. And check out the Civic Data Design Lab website at civicdatadesignlab.mit.edu.
Awesome. Well, Sarah, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Great talking to you.